Welcome to today's episode of our Mythic Plus recap at the beginning of week 8, we can also say the beginning of patch 11.1.5, also titled The Death of Fire Mage. Because even though this one is the release of patch 11.1.5, what was bigger, meaning when was the balance tuning being released, was last week, not this new reset. So we went a full reset worth of changes, a full reset worth of players trying out all of the, for example, buffs of certain specs, or for example the big nerf to Discipline Priest, etc, etc. So now we get to see the effect of these changes on the results. We can skip by the effects of the changes through the tanks very quickly, because nothing has changed when it comes to the popularity of the tanks. It's still just Vengeance everywhere. Even though technically Vengeance received a very minor nerf, a very minor CC nerf last week, obviously it wasn't going to be enough to change anything when it comes to the popularity of the spec. Now, there was some slight more question about the one that was nerfed much more, which was Discipline Priest. They had a yes, it was slightly smaller nerf in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. Discipline was nerfed. However, we also tried to point out that the effect, the value of the nerf would have still kept Discipline doing what they do differently than any other healer, still a very powerful tool in Mythic Plus, because being able to give out Absorb shields, even if now they are nerfed, so even if now the normal Absorb shield will be 3.5 or so million HP and the crit shield will be about 7 million, those are still very powerful and will still be almost necessary, almost required to stay alive at high keys for quite a few specs, namely the Discipline Priest himself, and also namely the Balance Druid, which is by far the squishiest one in the meta comp of Mythic Plus. We can still see though, despite Discipline Priest still being the default popular pick, that last week there was a massive heavy resurgence of Verso Shamans. You know, the number of course is still very dominant for Discipline, but Verso Shamans increased their popularity in high keys, so top 2000 keys of Mythic Plus last week, by 60%. They went from 14% of representation to 22%, which is the highest any other healer not being Discipline reached this season. So it definitely is somewhat relevant, this growth of Resto Shaman. Of course, you would have the same questions and the same worries for Shamans. What happens when you reach that kind of level, 16 to 17 level, which is, you know, title-worthy level right now? What happens to the specs, as we mentioned, like Balance Druid, for example, that can't survive certain hits without help, because they are quite squishy and their defensives are quite poor when your healer is Resto Shaman, right? Resto Shaman traditionally doesn't really have many ways to help you in single target, right? You don't have externals. Resto Shaman is notorious for not really having anything to give out to players other than single target heals, which are not a very powerful ways to save players. What they do have though is higher throughput. It is something we touched on after the nerf of Discipline. It could have been possibly the checkpoint, the threshold that would have made it harder for Discipline Priest after the nerfs to continue later down in the season. Just the healing, the group healing of certain healing check bosses like Swamp Face or like the Candle King, that Discipline Priest simply is worse at clearing compared to other healers with higher HPS like Resto Shaman. However, the downside, as mentioned, is that they are much worse at saving single players, helping a single player, for example, with a heavy dot, as they don't really have many ways to help them besides just straight up healing them. So we have seen a dip in the popularity of Discipline after the nerf. They are still solidly in command as the most popular spec though, even at high key levels. However, where we do have our biggest change is of course in the DPS department. Last time we had our recap was over 8 days ago. And just a couple of days into the nerfs and the buffs to the specs, we had our video about Arcane Mage surging. So now that the full week has gone by after the changes, we have the full picture of the results. The full picture of the results has been that Fire Mage has collapsed in its popularity in favor of Arcane Mage. You can see it from multiple different sources, not just the popularity in here. Even if you look at the DPS, for example, you scroll all the way back to, for example, week 3, you see there were 12,000 mages in the top keys compared to only 279 arcane mages. And then you go up to week 4, there is still 13,000 compared to 900. You go up to week 5, there is 10,000 compared to 700. You go up to week 6, now it's 9.6k to 1.9k, right the week before the buffs. And then last week, the week when the buffs actually launched for Arcane, it's 7.4k Arcane Mages and 5.8 Fire Mages. So there is the turnover of Arcane beating Fire. And then just a couple of days into this new week, we have 1.3k Mages so far compared to the 500 Fire Mages. In the overall tier list, you will see, of course, Fire is still keeping up in S tier simply because they still have the current results of their meta state of the past few weeks to carry them, but Arcane is quickly rising up the ranks, very simply because the majority of the Arcane Mages are just Fire Mages re-rolling to Arcane. For example, even in here, you will see, unsurprisingly, that whether you're looking at pretty much all keys, the Arcane and Fire Mage average score is practically the same. Even if you go up in the top keys only, their score is practically the same. That's very simple because the same score you had as Fire, you still have it as Arcane once you swap over to Arcane to play. You can see it pictured also in the overall damage in keys since the weekly balance tuning of last week. You can see that in the overall results there are more and more Arcane Mages being at the top of the overall damage than there are Fire Mages. Fire Mages are still being shown as doing more damage in the couple of more AoE heavy dungeons like Priory and like Floodgate over Arcane. And the reason why, of course, these mages get to do this much damage in Floodgate is because, of course, they are still playing their flat out blanket AoE build based on Flamestrike. As you can see, their pyro usage is very, very low, mostly limited to boss damage. Otherwise, they just do blanket wide AoE, which is kind of what is not that much needed when you are being put in a group that has Unholy DK and Balanced Druid, right? That's what they are good at. If you look at the average DPS in keys, I think it was, since something like week 4, they were shown as the top 2 damage dealers in Mythic Plus keys. Week 5, week 6, week 7, it's been over a month basically, and these 2 specs have been at the top of the damage. So pretty much your AoE damage is covered. Your blanket wide AoE damage in these keys is covered by both Unholy and by Balance. So that's what we were talking about when we had the video about the rising power of Arcane. The fact that those 2 were already bringing you the AoE damage you wanted. So what you kind of wanted to fill the rest of your damage profile in a key wasn't to have another one of these specs trying to do AoE flat out wide AoE damage just like them. What you wanted was a spec able to do more targeted damage, more prio damage to the more dangerous enemies, the more high HP enemies, which is something that, of course, Arcane Mage can do much better than Fire Mage because they have Arcane Barrage, which is a much better tool at doing prio damage. It is obviously a weakness in large pools because Arcane Barrage is practically capped at 5 targets. Of course, you have other ways to do some, some splash AoE damage around, like Touch of the Magi, like Arcane Orb, even Magi's Spark blowing up to do AoE damage, but in general, of course, it won't really match the AoE damage Balance and Unholy can do. This one being the absolute top #1 log for an Arcane Mage in Priory, and it's still, despite being the top one, a good 10% DPS away from both Balance and Unholy, and this is also in overall damage. If you start looking at the actual big, large AoE pools, that's where you see the difference in the usefulness of the specs. Balance and Unholy are doing the AoE damage, and Arcane's AoE damage will obviously suffer more. Where Arcane can match or even beat these two specs is once you go in single target fights. Basically just, bosses. That's where Arcane can find its usefulness, more so than the current value of a Fire Mage. And that's how we have gotten this swap from Fire to Arcane so far in Mythic Plus after the tuning of last week. This was just about the only main major change at very high keys. We have been seeing, of course, slowly over time, most of the other specs, lose out in popularity, as is tradition. You start every season with Ret Paladin being very popular. Ret was at 13% of representation in high keys early on, went down to 9, to 8, to 6, to 5, and now last week it went down to 4% of representation. The one who has increased a bit more in the past couple of weeks, actually, in fact, they doubled their representation in a couple of weeks, has been Marksmanship Hunter. And it's interesting because we did mention that over the past month you had Balance and Unholy as the top 2 of overall damage in Mythic Plus, but if you look at Marksmanship from week 4 to week 6 and then week 7, Marksmanship has been right below them. They do have very good AoE damage, especially in not as wide, not as large pools, as they are more target capped than both Balance and Unholy. At this point, it's pretty much just a matter of composition. Hunter is more squishy and has less CC. Also, they bring less utility to the group compared to a Druid. They also don't have as good of a raid buff as a Druid has, since Druid has Mark of the Wild for verse, Hunter has just the Hunter's Mark, which is also practically useless when you pull 10 or 15 or 20 mobs, really. So it doesn't really bring nearly as much. That might be really just the reason why it hasn't made it in the meta compared to Balance Druid. Not really because their damage is that bad or that poor right now. They would be there pretty much to fill the niche, a mix of Balance and Fire Mage, in the sense that they do much like a Mage, this time an Arcane Mage, much more damage in smaller target counts. You see, this is Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain is one of the smallest target count pools dungeon, and you see, Marksmanship able to gap heavily even Unholy DKs, which is similar to what you can see an Arcane Mage also beating both Balance and Unholy in a Theater of Pain key. And then you see something like a Priory where Hunter has, more trouble doing heavy damage in larger pools, because a lot of their damage comes from their ricocheting aim shot, which is target capped, as well as multi-shot and even sentinel, and rapid fire, pretty much just explosive shot, is also damage reduced beyond 5 enemies. So it wouldn't really be, in the case of Marksmanship, a problem with damage, more so with what they bring besides their damage. So this one is the situation for now. You can even see in 14 and up keys the popularity of compositions. This is for the entire season, where of course the original comp was beating everyone else. If you start looking though from, for example, 2 resets ago, it still looks like Fire Mage is by far the best, and Arcane is not even in the top 5 of best comps. And then you start from last reset specifically, and suddenly now Arcane in the 14 plus keys is the most run key over Fire. We'll have to see if now it's beating even the 16 plus keys, and it does. Even in 16 plus, now we're talking about basically title range, 0.1% key level, Arcane has also passed Fire Mage. This one is the main change for the week, I guess we can say for last week of Mythic Plus. The overtaking of Fire by Arcane, which we have already predicted and heralded over a week ago. Now it has gone into full effect. For the other, not really anything else changing when it comes to DPS, only mentioning that Marksmanship right now does have very good damage, it just lacks in practically the other areas that you would want a spec to become meta for in Mythic Plus. Vengeance and any tank changes hasn't really changed anything in the meta state of tanks, and for healers we have seen a heavy increase of Rest of Shaman, although we still don't think that will really lead to anything, even though we might see Discipline struggle in healing checks as we go higher up in keys, but still likely their value in saving single players' lives with their absorb shields is still likely too strong to pass up. This is what we have for this weekly reset recap when it comes to Mythic Plus, after we have gone through a full week of the results of the balance tuning and see their effects fully in action. So for today, on this Thursday, it is now time to leave each other once again. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. And now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yep, it's that time of the season. You wake up, there's the sun everywhere, flowers are sprouting, birds are chirping, and you're still feeling cold.